be a link to a sign up Genius, and that will allow you to sign up for a time and ring the bell. It'll be a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. Just got it.
Link to a sign up Genius. Oops. And that will allow you to y'all still there?
Yeah.
All right, great. Yeah. I think it is now officially streaming to YouTube. So great. So there'll be a sign up Genius in your email. You can sign up for that. And we'll announce that at 10:30 as well, Kathy. So hopefully folks will sign up. So welcome to Adult Forum. We are doing, as you know, this is the third Sunday of Advent, not the first. The first Sunday of Advent was right after Thanksgiving. The second Sunday of Advent was our annual meeting at St. John's. So here on the third and fourth Sunday of Advent, we are having a special two-part lecture on the Psalter in the Book of Common Prayer. This is a piece of our larger year-long class on the prayer book. We've covered the history of the Book of Common Prayer, and now we're going to look at the Psalter specifically with an expert who I'll introduce in a moment. And then we'll continue to look at the Book of Common Prayer throughout the spring and its use, how we use it in the Episcopal Church today, digging into both the stuff we do every week, but also the things we do more occasionally, like marriages and ordinations and confirmations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So welcome. And our speaker today is Dr. Collin Cornell. Collin taught me the Psalter in seminary. I took a semester-long class looking at the Psalms. And while we won't cover all of that material today, I'm sure some of the highlights from that will be shared with you all today. Collin is currently the coordinator for the Center of Religion and Environment at Sewanee. And he is a lecturer extraordinaire in this Zoom world. He lectures across the country and world. He just recently helped put together an academic conference that was online only with folks in Europe speaking Dutch, Collin? Yeah, so Dutch, English, academic conference, looking at a book that he and a Dutch theologian translated from Dutch into English for the first time. So he is a man of many talents and stripes, and we're really lucky to have him for 2 weeks. So without further talking on my part, I'll let Collin get started.
Sure. Thanks so much, Ben, for that intro, and thanks to you all for coming out. Ben, I am going to share screen
okay.
if I'm able to. Yes.
Should be able to.
Great. Can y'all see this all right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes. And I'm going to mute the rest of y'all, but just unmute if you have a question or wave your hands if you can't get it unmuted, and I'll ask you to unmute.
Yeah.
And do remember we're recording to YouTube, so.
I'll say too that I will invite feedback at several points. So do let that finger hover over the unmute button if you would. So once again, thanks. We are going to be talking today, next week, about the Psalter in the Book of Common Prayer. And I have essentially a two-part agenda for these occasions that we're going to be together. Today, you can see there under part one, talking about the rubrics and the routes. That is the different ways that the Book of Common Prayer, that common worship in the Episcopal tradition guides our engagement with the Psalter. And then actually, maybe perhaps we'll see the bulk of our time this morning want to explore the translation itself. That is, what is this Psalter? What version is this that we find in the Book of Common Prayer? I don't know. You'll have to tell me. Perhaps your previous sessions on the history of the Book of Common Prayer have touched on that. Ben's giving me a shaking head, so maybe that'll be fresh. And then next week, I'll sort of tease things up a little bit this morning, but especially next week, we want to talk about the shape of the Psalter, which is maybe an unfamiliar thought for many of us, that the Psalms it's not just kind of a grab bag of individual items, but that the Psalter has a program, has an arc, has a shape to it, And that can become clearer, I think, on a straight shot through the Psalter, but we'll talk more about that next week. Before all that, though, and here's where I invite that finger to hover over the unmute button, I just wanted to check in with you all with these two questions, which are, for the first especially, fairly open-ended, and yet I thought maybe this isn't something that you've heard each other speak about. Just what words, descriptors would you use to describe your experience with the Psalter? What has that been like? Any thoughts?
Like most Episcopalians, we don't pick up the Bible until we're old like I am. And so as a child, the only parts of the Psalter I ever heard were in the prayer book on Sundays, and when we would flip through things, because we didn't have those fancy programs we have now, and they were often said in a monotone without much inflection. And I guess that was the way some people thought poetry would be read. I don't know. But then as an adult, I started reading the Bible, and as an adult, I started going to funerals. And my husband tells me that he even learned the 23rd Psalm in school, even though he was in a public school in Maryland. We didn't have that in any of the public schools I went to. But so the 23rd Psalm is the one that I know the most because I have heard it over the years in funerals.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Kathy. Yeah, and actually, we're going to talk in a moment about the 23rd Psalm, because I figured that it's probably the one that's most familiar to us all. But thanks for that. Yeah, so I hear there kind of initial monotony, maybe a less colorful encounter with the Psalter, and then some kind of depth in your adult life because of your own initiative. Really sounds like good. Anybody else? Just how would you describe your experience with the Psalter? Maybe it's tough to think about it because it is such kind of background, constant, rhythmic in your life of worship. But anybody else?
Growing up in the country, we didn't have any Episcopal churches. I was in a Methodist tradition and with a lot of Baptist influence, but in public school, just like I'm old enough too, just like Kathy was mentioning about her husband, Randy, in second grade, I learned the 23rd Psalm, Psalm 1, Psalm 100, and all 66 books of the Bible. It was just as good as a religious school.
Amazing. Yeah, those are good ones to know too. Excellent. Other folks, your experience with the Psalter? I might actually use my my guest lecturer discretion and ask Ben, what's your experience been with the Psalter?
I first really experienced the Psalter when I started doing the daily office. I don't know if you all would know this, but I had the chance to do the daily office every day my senior year of high school at the church that I grew up at. They were a parish that offered it every day all year long. And so I actually dropped a class in high school. I dropped German 4 so that I didn't have to go to school until like 9:30. And then I could go to 8 o'clock morning prayer at church and have a cup of coffee with, the church folk who go to church every day. And at this point, I was well on my way to doing what I'm doing now, obviously. But that was the first time where I was reading the Psalter a lot and every day and going through it. For me, I think someone said rhythmic or rhythm earlier, and that's what the Psalter feels like to me. It's kind of the pulse of worship, especially the daily office, but also the Eucharist. It's a constant, and because a lot of it feels like similar material and it's all sort of laid out poetically, it does kind of feel like a rhythm, a part of the heartbeat of worship, if you will.
Yeah, that's great, man. Yeah. I think for my own part, my experience was sporadic in youth. It's kind of every kind of brand of Christian I was ever involved with sort of does pray the Psalter. It's important to cross all, branches of Christian life. But it wasn't again until sort of really beginning the office that it became as regular a rhythm. And especially I've come to really love and appreciate the Jubilate and the Venite, those two sort of psalms that are so integral to the office, and committing them to memory. I'm actually thankful that several of you all just now spoke of having the 23rd Psalm. I think Larry mentioned Psalm 100. What was the other one, Larry? There was another one too, I think, right?
Yes, Psalm 1 as well.
Psalm 1, yeah, right. So having those kind of in your mental repertoire, I think is really spiritually nourishing and useful. So I'm sure there's more to say on this point, but thank you to those of you who did speak up just about your experience with the Psalter. And maybe you've already addressed this question, but anybody else want to jump in terms of favorite psalm?
So is the Jubilate the one that starts with "Oh, be joyful in the Lord, all ye lands"?
Yes.
That's my favorite. I don't know what number it is. Is that 100? No?
I think that is 100.
Yeah. And then the Venite is what, 95, I think. Yeah.
And the reason
Excellent.
it's my favorite was because we said it every week when we did morning prayer back before you were born, probably. That was what we did before 1979. It was we did morning prayer every Sunday, except for one Sunday a month, we did the Eucharist. So for morning prayer, that was the psalm. And I just loved that all my youth.
Yeah, I love that one too. Thanks for saying that. Anybody else favorites? I don't know if it's my favorite, but one that has been very much on my mind the last couple of years. It's a weird one, Psalm 45, which is the one and only royal psalm. No, not royal psalm, but royal wedding psalm in the Psalter. Maybe that brings it to mind. I don't know. It has kind of a Song of Songs vibe to it. So that one's been important to me in the last years. But all right, well, thank you all for checking in about that. Just wanted to ground our conversation in kind of, your lived experience of the Psalter before we zoom out and think about how it is in the Book of Common Prayer and the translation and its shape. So in terms of the Book of Common Prayer, noteworthy that on its title page, we have the Psalter explicitly flagged as a major ingredient in what it is. And that's because of just how integral it is to practically, pretty much every service, devotion, etc., that's contained within the Book of Common Prayer. So I want to speak about some of the rubrics and some of the routes through the Psalter in the Book of Common Prayer. Ben helped me out with some of these figures, but if one reads the Psalms only during the Sunday Eucharist, which I think Kathy mentioned that was sort of your experience earlier on in life, it means actually that you don't hear the entirety of the Psalter, because the Sunday lectionary readings, assigned readings, they include most of the Psalms, but not all. Some Psalms are omitted from that. And there's more flexibility in, say, like the propers and so on. It means that it's sort of hit or miss whether you're really going to make your way through even most of those Psalms. But if one truly sort of maxed out on what's available in terms of the Sunday lectionary, one would hear most of the Psalter in a year's time. In the daily office, one would hear or recite all of the Psalms in 7 weeks. So 2 months, a little over 2 months. But that's only if kind of another liturgical event doesn't intervene. So again, a little bit of condition there, an asterisk around that, hearing the entirety of the Psalter in 7 weeks' time. And then there's also the 30-day cycle, which is really truly sort of embedded in the Book of Common Prayer's presentation of the Psalter itself. And 30 days, there it is. That's how long it takes So anything else there, Ben, that deserves saying? Wanted to open the floor to you.
If you just go with what the prayer book tells you to do, you will sort of, even in the daily office, you can omit things that are bracketed. So anytime there is a psalm of cursing or a psalm of, that one might feel is problematic, they bracket it. And so you won't hear the evil song, or I don't know tell me the word, Collin,
imprecatory.
Imprecatory, thank you.
Is the technical term. Yeah, the cursing, just a fancy word for cursing psalms. Yeah, that's right.
So if you read the prayer book and omit the brackets, you miss an element of the Psalter that is harder to deal with. You just don't deal with it. But...
Yep. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Unless you're going through a divorce.
Unless then, right, or a national crisis of some kind, various circumstances when it becomes more appropriate to use imprecatory psalms. So I think you're actually right about that. Here's another piece to remember about the rubrics, the routes through the Psalter in the Book of Common Prayer. The BCP on page 582, right before the Psalter proper, does provide some instructions or recommendations for how to say, sing, recite the Psalter. But even apart from that instruction, the mode in which many or most of us engage the Psalms is as sung, chanted, maybe monotonously, like Kathy had said, reciting antiphonally, and that means that in terms of our experience, how we absorb and counter the Psalms, it's, I would say, more along the line of like a hymn, something that we are saying, singing perhaps, but not so much something that we reflect on in the same way as the gospel text or the other Old Testament readings and so on. And that's reinforced, that sensibility, I think, by the fact that I would say majority of the time in the Anglican world, the Psalms are rarely preached. So we don't have our kind of intellectual, homiletical focus so much on the Psalms as a resource to be wrestled with thoughtfully, just like we wouldn't take a hymn and sort of try to, exposit it in a sermon typically. But I do think that something is lost, perhaps, when our way of inhabiting the Psalter is only singing, chanting, reading. It makes it kind of does make it more background noise. It is rhythmic. It's there. It gets certain pieces of the Psalter more familiar to us, the Venite, the Jubilate, but it doesn't engender reflection, or even maybe I'll say spiritual kind of instruction from and with the Psalter. In other words, there's untapped possibilities, I think, for our Christian life in the Psalter. And that's partly what we'll try to get up to in these times together, is filling out some further ways that we can live with, think through the Psalms. So enriching and deepening what might just be kind of background, ambient sort of worship noise, perhaps, hopefully more than that, but possibly that for many of us. So I want to say a few things about the translation itself. What is this Psalter that's in the Book of Common Prayer? Page 14 from the BCP notes that the citations in this book, referring to the BCP itself, follow the numeration of the RSV, except the Psalms. So the Psalms are kind of, just in terms of how the actual chapter and numbers run, are different from all the rest of the scriptures that are included in the Book of Common Prayer. And further along that line, it's not just the numbers that demarcate the Psalms, but the translation itself is not, as with the rest of the texts in the Book of Common Prayer, it is not the RSV, the Revised Standard Version, nor is it the Authorized Version, the kind of original, authorized version, and it wishes to say the King James Version. So what is it? If it's not King James, the Psalms are not in the King James translation, They are not in the the revised authorized version, the revised standard version. What is this text? What is the translation? It is a revised and modified form of the translation by Miles Coverdale. Miles Coverdale. Who is this fellow? He was an English priest, actually later a bishop in England during the Reformation period. And he was himself actually of Lutheran, continental Reformation sympathy. He had few friends in high places, but one of his friends in high places was Thomas Cromwell. So that just perhaps tells you something about his backdrop of someone who is on board with some of the vernacular type reforms happening in England. That is, he really, like Tyndale, like Wycliffe before him, wants to place the Bible into the hands of regular, ordinary Christian people. And he actually, because of how tumultuous the situation was for him, he was exiled to what is now the Netherlands, Holland. And it was while he was there, actually, that he tried to complete William Tyndale's Bible translation, which was not, didn't cover the entire Christian Bible. Tyndale had translated the New Testament. He translated the first 5 books of the Bible. And apparently he had notes on other stuff, but the only materials that were available to this guy Coverdale were the Pentateuch and New Testament. And so he took it upon himself, Coverdale, to make up the difference, to translate the rest of the Bible, including the Psalms. The challenge for Coverdale, this guy, was that he did not know Hebrew, which makes translating the Old Testament a tricky wicket. So what he did instead was to consult existing German translations, the Latin translation, apparently multiple Latin translations. And so he sort of filled out what had been lacking in William Tyndale's Bible. And the Coverdale Bible, which is his total translation into English of the Bible, was completed in 1535. There were some other Bibles then that followed from him. So Coverdale, this guy, took what an earlier translator, Tyndale, had done and added to it his own translations, filling it out. And then those versions, the Matthew Bible, the Great Bible, these are some of the first complete English Bible translations. And in fact, the Great Bible was the first officially authorized English translation. Now, here's where things perhaps get a little more sinuous. The King James Version, which is probably, I would suspect, the version you all tell me that you had to memorize from, Psalm 23 or what have you in public school. It's also sort of the air we breathe in the English-speaking world is the King James Version, is the background for kind of all subsequent Bible translation. The translators for that project kind of started from scratch. They didn't incorporate these earlier versions, at least not as directly as Coverdale did. And so they actually retranslated the Psalms. The King James Version went back to the Hebrew, which Coverdale couldn't do, that exceeded his capacities as a translator, and they did a fresh translation of the Psalms. But here's where things start to get funny for sort of Anglican use of the Psalter, is the 1662 Book of Common Prayer had the option of using this relatively fresher King James Version of the Psalms. But by then it was sort of too late. People in the pews had already been using Coverdale, had already been using this earlier version of the Psalms. And so there was resistance to sort of introducing this new, untested King James Version of the Psalms. And so the Book of Common Prayer accommodated that by essentially promoting the King James for everything except for the Psalms, because they were already known and loved by regular Anglican folk in the Coverdale version. And so beloved, so well known was Coverdale's version of the Psalms that the American versions, 28, 79, their updates pretty much touched up Coverdale's Psalter. They revised it. They tried to sort of bring it into closer alignment with the Hebrew, but they didn't actually just swap in the NRSV or any of these other more modernized English translations and more scholarly translations. They essentially kind of left the bulk of Coverdale and then finessed it to try to make it more faithful to the Hebrew. So just a few examples of this that I thought might be intriguing for us to visit. First here, you can see this is from the Coverdale version of the Psalms, the left-hand side of this page, small text, but which is also the version in the first, the sort of 1662 Book of Common Prayer, the 23rd Psalm. So familiar text, but you can see here, even at a glance, I expect several differences from the King James Version that might be familiar to you. Therefore, can I lack nothing is not the same as, what is it, saints? In the version that you know, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I see the lips saying it, but I can't hear it.
I shall not want.
I shall not want. That's right. So Coverdale's different from that. Therefore, can I lack nothing? And then you remember in your familiar King James Version, we have not a green pasture, but what? Yes, I see the lips moving.
Pastures.
Pastures, right, plural, which is closer to the Hebrew. Because again, the King James Version started from scratch, went back to the Hebrew. Coverdale's working from just his knowledge of German and Latin and whatever. So here we have just a green pasture. And you can look and just sort of scan down and see some differences from that King James Version that you know. Convert my soul, bring me forth in the paths of righteousness, valley of the shadow of death. I mean, that's the same. And them that trouble me might be a little different from what you know. But anyway, a few differences. And then if you look here on the right-hand side of this presentation, you can see that 1928, this is now many centuries later, in the US, we have the 23rd Psalm, and there are a few very small differences here. But really, for the most part, this is nearly identical with the 1662 version. So they really did not terribly much mess with the Coverdale Psalter in the 1928 American prayer book. Still, we have a pasture, we have can I lack nothing, we have convert my soul, paths of righteousness, and so on. So mostly the same. And then here we come a little closer to our own context. This is 28 versus the 79. And you can see that the 1979 has brought this version of Psalm 23 a little bit closer to the King James. We have pastures now. We have still waters rather than waters of comfort. We have revives my soul rather than convert my soul. Right pathways is very different from paths of righteousness. And so in these ways, the 79 has taken kind of the bones of the Coverdale Psalter and has moved it a little more towards what scholars now think is the best version of the Hebrew, and also taking into account that strong English language tradition of the King James Version. So there's a few things here that are kind of more King Jamesy, but also more in alignment with scholarly consensus about the Hebrew. So let me just pause there. We're coming down to the end of our time, but to invite any questions that you all might have about this history of the BCP Psalter.
It's interesting that we have an older version even than the King James Version.
That's correct. Yeah, that's right. An older version than King James. And yeah, by popular demand, essentially. It was so known and so loved that they couldn't try to fix it when King James came around. Yeah, that's right. Good. Other folks, questions or observations here about this? Any other differences here that you spot? Let's see. Those who trouble me is still different from the King James. If you remember just offhand your memorized version, isn't it in the King James, it's my enemies, in the presence of my enemies, versus here, the BCP, presence of those who trouble me, which is just an update of Coverdale, them that trouble me, goodness and mercy, and so on. So here, just for contrast's sake, you can see the NRSV is quite different. We have a lot of differences. Here's the I shall not want, which the 79 still has a little bit of a different feeling from that. I shall not be in want. We have pastures, plural, still waters, restores my soul now is different than revives my soul in the BCP, and so on. So a lot of subtle differences. Some of these are in the NRSV, sort of trying to take advantage of the best of contemporary scholarship on the Psalms to modernize and to make it more accurate. So that's just a bit on the Coverdale Psalter, which in revised, modified, updated form still really is what's there in the Book of Common Prayer. That also means for our purposes that you can't find it anywhere else. What's there between the covers of your Book of Common Prayer is pretty much just there. This is its own distinct kind of tradition of revising and updating the Psalter, but following from that version, as Larry said, that's older than the King James. So, friends, next week, I want to talk about not just the kind of translation, the text of the Psalter, but to think with you about the shape of the Psalter. That the Psalter, as I said before, has a program, has 5 books, has some strategic placement of certain kinds of psalms, has a preface and a conclusion, has a midpoint, kind of has a general V shape of sinking all the way down to the bottom and then returning to praise at its conclusion. So we'll think and talk more about that next week. But for now, once more, I invite your questions, your comments about this, the Psalter in the Book of Common Prayer.
I guess I still think of the 23rd Psalm as the one with the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures, or he leadeth me besides the still waters. That's the one that I know, even though I never memorized it, that's the one that my soul responds to, because I grew up with the old prayer book and the these and thous, and so this, I don't know, it's just what I'm remembering.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's actually some studies have been done that show the these and thous and the kind of maketh, the more archaic language, maybe counterintuitively make it easier for our minds to hang on to and memorize them. Because a text that sounds more like how people sound now sort of slips through our mental gears faster. Whereas if it kind of clogs up the gears a little bit, it's actually more helpful for retention.
It's called cognitive dissonance.
Good, yeah. The other intriguing thing in response to your comment, Kathy, is that the Book of Common Prayer, it's true, in the 1928 is full of these, thous, and all the rest, but its version of the Psalms is not actually, and you can see here, is not quite the one that sort of is just in the American ether, maketh me to lie down and so on. It's actually sort of different from that. Feed me in a green pasture.
The 79 prayer book does print the King James version somewhere in the funeral section. So it doesn't print all 150, but just Psalm 23 is printed in King James in the prayer book.
Yeah,
because of this thing we're talking about.
Yeah, concession in a way
Yeah.
to sort of what most Americans know.
Mhm.
You know, I think my background in the King James Version led to my appreciating as an English major undergraduate Shakespeare and 17th, 18th century English novels as well, the language.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I'll say too, is in response to that, that part of what endeared Coverdale to English speaking worshipers, it's not just because that's what they had, but because there is a real elegance to the Coverdale Psalter. And that it's actually the sort of the, speaking back again of rhythms, the way that he syncopates the language of the Psalter is actually not quite the same in the King James, as elegant and courtly and all the rest as the King James is. And so that's part of why folks wanted to hang on to the Coverdale Psalter, even though, yes, okay, now we have the new King James, this fresh, King James version, but they really liked the feeling, the rhythm, the sound of the Coverdale Psalms. Good. Anybody else want to jump in? Comments, questions about any of this history?
The only other comment I want to make, it goes along with all this rhythm talk, is that so many of the hymns use the language of the Psalter, but it's sometimes changed a little bit to make it fit the music that somebody's written, even though they are based on the words of the song.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's helpful to remember, I think. So thank you for that, because it does mean that in terms of our just engagement with the Psalms, the hymns are another important way that actually does happen in our life of prayer and worship, is kind of these rephrasings of the Psalms that happen in hymnody. That's right. And it's there that you kind of maybe hear the content of the Psalms in a different way, versus it just being this kind of ambient sort of, it's there, we say it, we sing it, but a different way of letting it kind of hit or letting it touch our soul.
Well, thank you for your time this morning and for your lecture. I am gonna call time because I have to drive back to church for 10:30. So it's great to be with you all, and with those who will watch this lecture later as well. And Dr. Cornell will be back next week on the 19th for part 2, the shape of the Psalter.
Great.
Thank you
Yes,
all.
thank
Great to be
you.
with you.
Thank you
All
all.
right.
Hope you have a good rest of your Sunday. And if you're coming to church, we'll see you at 10:30.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.